The sled creaked to a halt outside of McKenzie's trading post, sending a shower of powdery snow that caught the afternoon light like scattered diamonds. Eleanor Reed pressed her face against the frost-covered window, her deep blue eyes scanning the rugged outpost of Timber Creek for any glimmer of hope. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What she saw instead was Trapper James Blackwood standing motionless on the porch of his cabin, his weathered hand gripping his walking stick as he watched her father trudge through knee-deep snow with the careful movements of a man carrying shame heavier than any burden. Thomas Reed's boots crunched through the crusty snow with a hollow sound that seemed to echo Eleanor's sinking heart. In his trembling hands, he clutched a worn leather pouch that contained everything left of their family's fortune: 17 silver dollars and a handful of copper pennies. Not enough to pay their debts, not enough to save their homestead, not enough to prevent what was about to happen. But it was exactly enough to change the life of a trapper who had spent 15 years believing that connection was something beyond his reach. Peace, something you found in silence, and solitude the only companion he needed in the vast wilderness he called home. What James Blackwood didn't know as he watched Thomas approach the trading post with shoulders bent under an impossible weight was that this moment would shatter everything he thought he understood about loneliness, about the silence he'd wrapped around himself like armor, and about the kind of man he really was beneath the layers of isolation he'd built over the years. The morning had started like any other in the Reed household, with Eleanor tending to their dwindling food stores while her father repaired tools that seemed to break faster than they could be fixed. The bitter winter had lasted 5 months now, turning their once promising homestead into a frozen prison that mocked their efforts to survive its merciless grip. Their firewood supply had dwindled to a dangerous low, forcing them to burn furniture to stay warm, and their last pack horse had succumbed to the cold just 1 week prior. Thomas Reed had been a proud man once, before the accident that took Eleanor's voice, before the death of his wife, before the loans that accumulated like snowdrifts against their door. He had been known throughout the territory as a storyteller whose tales could make a room fall silent with wonder. His integrity was worth more than most men's written contracts, and his reputation as a skilled carpenter had made him prosperous enough to own a beautiful homestead just outside Timber Creek. But pride, Eleanor had learned, was a luxury they could no longer afford. "Papa," she had signed that morning, finding him standing at the window, staring out at the endless white landscape. "Maybe we should consider Mr. Thornton's offer. He's been wanting our land for his logging operation." "And with what money would Thornton buy our land?" Thomas interrupted, his voice carrying a bitterness that had grown deeper with each passing week. "The winter hit him too, child. Hit everyone in these parts." Eleanor set down the mending she'd been working on, her fingers stiff from the cold despite the small fire they allowed themselves each day. At 23, she had the kind of beauty that once made men stop their conversations when she walked past. Auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight, intelligent blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul, and a spirit that had remained unbroken despite her circumstances. She was also, though neither she nor her father spoke of it, trapped in a world of silence since the fever that had taken her voice 7 years ago. Her hands moved in the language they'd created together, a dance of fingers and gestures that spoke volumes to those who understood, but served as yet another barrier between her and a world that had little patience for those who were different. "There has to be another way," she signed, moving to stand beside him at the window. "Perhaps Mr. Morrison at the bank would extend our loan if we explained." Thomas's laugh was harsh and empty. "I've already spoken to Morrison twice." He made his position quite clear. He turned from the window, and Eleanor was startled to see tears gathering in her father's eyes. 30 days, Eleanor. That's what we have left before they take everything." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of crunching snow approaching their modest cabin. Through the frosted window they watched as Edwin McKenzie dismounted from his sturdy mountain pony, adjusting his fur coat despite the biting cold. McKenzie was a man who seemed to collect other people's misfortunes the way other men collected hunting trophies, and his trading post served as the unofficial center of commerce for 3 valleys. Eleanor felt her father stiffen beside her. They both knew why McKenzie had come. "Morning, Thomas," McKenzie called out as Thomas opened the door, his voice carrying the false warmth of a man who held all the cards in a rigged game. Brutal cold, isn't it? Though I suppose the weather's been especially hard on folks living alone without enough helping hands. Thomas stepped outside, Eleanor following close behind. Edwin, what brings you out our way? McKenzie's smile was as calculated as his business dealings. Oh, you know how it is, just checking on my neighbors, seeing how everyone's faring in these difficult times. His eyes lingered on Eleanor for just a moment too long before returning to Thomas. Though I have to say, I've been hearing some concerning rumors about your situation. What kind of rumors? Thomas's voice was carefully controlled, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders. Well, folks are saying you might be in some financial difficulty. Now, I don't like to pry into other people's affairs, but as a successful businessman, I feel a certain obligation to help my community when times get tough. Eleanor stepped forward, instinctively protective of her father's dignity. Her hands moved in quick, graceful signs that McKenzie couldn't understand. My daughter says we appreciate your concern, Mr. McKenzie, but we're managing just fine. Thomas translated, his voice steady despite the lie. McKenzie's laugh was soft and patronizing. My dear girl, there's no shame in facing hard times. Why, even the strongest trees sometimes need support during a storm. He turned back to Thomas. I have a proposition that might interest you. A way to solve all your problems in one clean transaction. Thomas's jaw tightened. I'm listening. I've been looking to acquire some additional property, expand my business interests. Your homestead, while currently in a difficult state, has excellent potential in the right hands. McKenzie paused, letting his words sink in. I'm prepared to offer you enough to clear your debts completely. Hope flickered in Thomas's eyes for just a moment before wariness took its place. What kind of offer? Well, that's where things get interesting. McKenzie continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. Given the current state of the property and the uncertainty in the market, I couldn't offer cash at full value. But I do have something that might interest you. A team of strong draft horses, excellent stock, worth at least 3 times what you owe the bank. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. Just for the land, Thomas clarified, hope beginning to bloom again. Not quite, my friend. McKenzie's smile became more pronounced. You see, I'm a man who appreciates efficiency in my transactions. The land, the cabin, the remaining livestock, and… He paused, his gaze settling on Eleanor once again. Your daughter's hand in marriage. The words hung in the air like ice crystals. Thomas's face went pale, then flushed red with anger. How dare you? Now, McKenzie interrupted, holding up his hands in a gesture of false peace. I know it sounds unusual, but think about it practically. Eleanor is a beautiful, intelligent young woman, but what prospects does she have here? A mute woman in these mountains? As my wife, she'd want for nothing. Security, comfort, respect in the community. And you'd have enough to start fresh somewhere else. Maybe where the land is more forgiving. Eleanor's hands moved rapidly, her signs sharp and forceful despite the fear constricting her chest. My daughter says she would rather freeze to death than marry you, Mr. McKenzie. Thomas translated, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. Strong sentiments from someone in your position, McKenzie replied, seemingly unbothered by her rejection. But consider this. What happens when the bank takes your home? Where will you go? What will you do? At least this way everyone gets something of value. Thomas stepped protectively in front of his daughter. Get off my property, Edwin. Now. McKenzie shrugged, pulling on his riding gloves with deliberate slowness. I understand you need time to think it over, but don't take too long, Thomas. Other opportunities have a way of evaporating when people wait too long to act. He mounted his horse with practiced ease. I'll be at the trading post for the next few days. When you're ready to be reasonable, you know where to find me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As McKenzie rode away, Eleanor felt her world shift on its axis. The casual way he had spoken about treating her like property, the assumption that her father's desperation would override any consideration for her feelings or her future. It was a kind of violence she had never experienced before, made worse by its veneer of respectability. She touched her father's arm, her fingers trembling. When he turned to her, she signed, "We will find another way, I promise." Thomas pulled away, unable to meet her eyes. "I need to think," he said hoarsely. "I need to figure out another way." But as the days passed, it became increasingly clear that there was no other way. The bank sent notice that their loan extension had been denied. The few neighbors who might have helped were struggling with their own battles against the winter's fury, and every morning brought them closer to losing everything they had worked for, everything that connected them to Eleanor's mother's memory, everything that made them who they were. On the fourth day after McKenzie's visit, Thomas sat at their small kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey they couldn't afford, staring at a letter from the bank that he couldn't bear to read again. Eleanor found him there as the weak winter sun began to set, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Papa?" she signed, settling into the chair across from him. When he looked up, Eleanor saw something in her father's eyes that frightened her more than McKenzie's proposition, more than the threat of homelessness, more than their uncertain future. She saw surrender. "I failed you," he whispered. "Your mother trusted me to take care of you, to protect you, and I failed completely." Eleanor reached across the table and took his weathered hands in hers. Her fingers moved deliberately, forming the signs they had created together after her illness. "You haven't failed anyone. We're facing something that's bigger than both of us, but that doesn't make you a failure." Thomas's voice cracked as he spoke. "What if McKenzie is right? What if this is the only way to keep you from ending up destitute in the streets? At least as his wife, you'd be safe, provided for." "No." Eleanor's hands moved emphatically. "There has to be another way. We just haven't found it yet." But even as she signed the words, Eleanor felt the weight of their situation pressing down on her like a physical force. She had seen what happened to women without family, without resources, without protection in frontier towns. The lucky ones found work as seamstresses or cooks, living hand-to-mouth in cramped quarters above shops. The unlucky ones. Eleanor pushed those thoughts away, focusing instead on her father's stricken face. That night she lay awake, listening to her father pace the floor below, his footsteps wearing a path between the kitchen and the front door as he wrestled with an impossible choice. Outside, wolves called to each other across the frozen landscape, their voices carrying a loneliness that seemed to echo the hollow feeling in Eleanor's chest. When morning came, Thomas emerged from his room looking as though he had aged 10 years overnight. Without a word, he began hitching their remaining ox to the old sled, his movements mechanical and purposeful. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window, knowing with terrible certainty what his decision had been. "We're going to town," he announced when he came inside, his voice carefully neutral. "There are arrangements to be made." Eleanor nodded, unable to trust herself to respond. She gathered their few remaining valuables, her mother's silver locket, a small bag of coins saved for emergencies that had never seemed as urgent as this one, and climbed onto the sled beside her father. As they pulled away from the cabin, she didn't look back. Some goodbyes were too final to bear witnessing. The journey to Timber Creek passed in silence, broken only by the creaking of the sled runners and the occasional snort from their weary ox. Eleanor found herself studying her father's profile, memorizing the lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way his hands gripped the reins with white-knuckled determination. She wondered if this would be one of the last times she would see him as her father, rather than as the man who had traded her away. As they crested the hill overlooking Timber Creek, Eleanor caught sight of James Blackwood standing outside his cabin at the edge of town, and something stirred in her chest. Not hope exactly, but a recognition of something kindred, of someone who understood isolation in a way few others could. She had seen him around town during their infrequent visits, had heard the stories about the trapper who had returned from the war unable to speak a word, who communicated only through gestures and notes when absolutely necessary, who seemed more comfortable with the wilderness than with other people. They had exchanged glances once or twice, a silent acknowledgement of their shared difference in a world that had little patience for those who couldn't conform. The sled rolled down the main street past the general store, the saloon, the small church with its frost-covered bell, toward the trading post that seemed to loom larger with each passing moment. Other townspeople went about their business, buying supplies, conducting transactions, living their normal lives, unaware that they were witnessing the end of one story and the beginning of another. When they finally stopped in front of McKenzie's trading post, Eleanor felt the last of her childhood slip away like meltwater through her fingers. Whatever happened next, whatever choices were made in the next few minutes, she would never again be simply Thomas Reed's daughter, protected and cherished, and free to dream of a future built on love rather than necessity. Thomas climbed down from the sled with the slow movements of a man walking to his own execution, and Eleanor knew that the moment she had been dreading, the moment that would define the rest of their lives, had finally arrived. James Blackwood had been watching the street from his cabin porch for the better part of an hour, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he observed the familiar rhythms of Timber Creek coming to life. At 35, he had developed an instinct for reading trouble in the movements of people, just as he could read the weather in the patterns of clouds or track game by the smallest disturbance in snow. Something about the quality of the morning light, the way conversations seemed to pause and restart when certain names were mentioned, told him that today would test every principle he had fought to preserve during his years of self-imposed isolation. The heavy fur coat on his shoulders felt like insufficient protection as he watched Thomas Reed's sled approach McKenzie's trading post. James had known Thomas by sight for nearly 5 years, had watched him struggle to raise his daughter alone after her illness, had witnessed the gradual erosion of hope that the harsh winters had carved into the man's features. What troubled James most was not just Thomas's obvious desperation, but the calculation he had seen in Edwin McKenzie's eyes over the past week whenever Eleanor Reed's name came up in conversation. James adjusted his walking stick and stepped away from his cabin, his boots finding purchase in the hard-packed snow that had carried him through countless solitary journeys over the years. He had learned long ago that the difference between survival and tragedy often came down to timing, being in the right place at the right moment to prevent something that could never be undone. As he approached the trading post, he could see McKenzie emerging from the building with the confident stride of a man who had orchestrated events to his advantage. The trader wore his finest coat, beaver fur trimmed with wolf, polished boots despite the snow, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Behind him trailed 2 of his employees, rough men whose presence at this particular transaction seemed unnecessary unless McKenzie anticipated resistance. "Thomas!" McKenzie called out with false warmth as the sled came to a complete stop. "Punctual as always. I do appreciate a man who honors his commitments." James positioned himself near the corner of the building, close enough to observe without appearing intrusive. From this vantage point, he could see Eleanor's face through the frost-covered window of the sled, pale but composed, her chin lifted in a gesture of defiance that spoke volumes despite her silence. Her hands were tightly clasped in her lap, knuckles white with tension or cold, perhaps both. Thomas climbed down from the sled with movements that seemed to cost him tremendous effort. "I've come to discuss your proposal," he said, his voice barely audible even in the morning stillness. "Excellent." McKenzie rubbed his hands together with obvious satisfaction. "Though I have to say, you've certainly taken your time considering what should have been a straightforward business transaction." "There's nothing straightforward about what you're asking," Thomas replied, a flash of his old fire breaking through his resignation. McKenzie's expression shifted subtly, revealing the steel beneath his veneer of respectability. "My dear Thomas, I'm offering you a solution to an impossible situation. Your debt's cleared, your daughter provided for, a fresh start somewhere the land might be more forgiving. Many men would consider such an offer a blessing." James felt his jaw tighten as the true nature of the transaction became clear. He had heard rumors, of course, whispered conversations in the trading post about McKenzie's unconventional business practices, his tendency to acquire things that weren't technically for sale. But hearing it spoken aloud, witnessing the casual way the man discussed trading a human being like property, ignited something cold and dangerous in James's chest. Eleanor stepped down from the sled, her movements graceful despite the obvious tension in her shoulders. Her hands moved in quick, expressive gestures that James recognized as the private language she shared with her father. "My daughter says she hasn't agreed to anything, Mr. McKenzie, and she won't be discussed as though she's not here," Thomas translated, his voice carrying both pride and pain. "Spirited," McKenzie chuckled, as though her objection amused rather than concerned him. "I do admire that quality in a woman. It suggests she'll provide interesting companionship during the long winter nights." The implication in his tone made James's hand tighten around his walking stick, though he forced himself to remain still. This wasn't yet a matter for intervention. Not technically, not if the transaction proceeded with Thomas's consent. But every instinct honed by years of survival in the wilderness screamed that he was witnessing something fundamentally wrong, something that would stain everyone involved, if allowed to proceed. Thomas reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. The deed to his property, James realized with growing alarm. "The land is worth more than my debts," Thomas said, his voice strengthening slightly. "Even in its current condition, it's valuable enough to clear what I owe and leave something over." "Perhaps," McKenzie conceded, "but you're forgetting the complications. The winter damage, the uncertainty about when the thaw might come, the general instability in frontier markets." He paused, letting his words settle. "And then there's the matter of your daughter's future. Surely her welfare is worth something to you." The casual cruelty of the statement hit Thomas like a physical blow. James watched the older man's shoulders sag as the full weight of his impossible choice pressed down on him. Here was a father faced with the prospect of his daughter's destitution weighed against her unwilling sacrifice, a choice no parent should ever have to make, orchestrated by a man who profited from others. Desperation. "Show me the horses," Thomas said finally, the words seeming to tear themselves from his throat. McKenzie gestured toward the stable behind his trading post. "Certainly, though I should mention that the animals come with certain expectations regarding the completion of our agreement." As they moved toward the stable, Eleanor's hands flashed in a series of signs too quick for James to interpret. Her face, however, told him everything he needed to know. The determination, the fear, the desperate search for alternatives that wouldn't materialize. The horses McKenzie led from the stable were indeed magnificent. A matched pair of Clydesdales with perfect conformation and intelligent eyes that seemed to assess everyone present. Under different circumstances, James might have admired the animals. Obvious quality. Today, the sight of such beauty being used as currency in human trafficking filled him with cold fury. "Purebred bloodlines," McKenzie announced proudly, running his hand along one horse's neck. "They're already proven themselves as workhorses, and they're young enough to provide labor for years to come. Conservative estimates put their value at $1,500, more than enough to clear your debts and provide a comfortable start elsewhere." Thomas walked slowly around the horses, his experienced eye taking in details that spoke to years of working with animals. James could see the conflict playing out on the farmer's weathered features. Recognition of the horses, genuine worth warring with revulsion at the price being demanded. Eleanor approached the horses with the natural ease of someone raised around animals. The Clydesdales responded immediately to her gentle touch, lowering their massive heads to accept her caress. "What are their names?" Thomas asked quietly. "Freedom and Liberty," McKenzie replied with obvious irony, "though I suppose they'll need new names once the transaction is complete. After all, freedom is a luxury few of us can truly afford, isn't it?" The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. James felt something crystallize in his chest, a clarity of purpose that had been building since he first witnessed McKenzie's predatory smile. This wasn't just about one family's tragedy or one man's greed. This was about the kind of community Timber Creek would become, the kind of future they would build, the kind of justice that would prevail when power faced off against desperation. "The papers," McKenzie continued, producing a leather portfolio from his coat. "Everything is properly drawn up and ready for signatures. Deed transfer, debt assumption, and quote." He paused, offering Eleanor a smile that made James's skin crawl. "Marriage contract. Simple, straightforward, beneficial to all parties." Eleanor recoiled as though struck. Her hands moved rapidly in signs that needed no translation. "My dear girl," McKenzie's tone became patronizing, "your agreement isn't actually required under territorial law. Your father has full authority to arrange your marriage as he sees fit, though I would of course prefer your willing participation." The legal technicality hit James like a revelation. McKenzie was right. Territorial law did give fathers broad authority over their daughters' marriages, especially in matters of family debt and survival. The trader had carefully constructed his proposal to operate within the bounds of law while violating every principle of human decency. Thomas's hands trembled as he reached for the papers. "I need a moment to review these." "Certainly," McKenzie gestured toward a bench outside his office. Take all the time you need, though I should mention that I have other interested parties if you decide this arrangement doesn't suit your needs. The threat was clear. Refuse this deal and face an even worse alternative. James recognized the pattern of manipulation, the way McKenzie had systematically eliminated every other option before presenting his proposal as the only reasonable choice. It was predation disguised as business, exploitation wrapped in the language of mutual benefit. As Thomas studied the documents with the concentration of a man reading his own execution warrant, Eleanor moved closer to the horses, finding comfort in their gentle presence. James watched her whisper something to the animals, her lips forming words that no one could hear, as though speaking to them in a way she couldn't speak to people. "Mr. Blackwood," McKenzie called out suddenly, having apparently noticed James's presence. "How good of you to join us. I was just conducting a bit of business with Mr. Reed here. Nothing that requires outside attention, of course." James stepped forward, his movements deliberate and measured. Though he hadn't spoken a word in over 7 years, not since returning from the war, his presence carried a weight that made men like McKenzie instinctively wary. He pulled out the small slate and chalk he carried for necessary communications and wrote swiftly before turning it toward McKenzie. "Private business or public exploitation?" McKenzie's smile became more strained. "Now, Mr. Blackwood, I'm sure you'll agree that arrangements between consenting parties fall outside your concern." James wiped the slate clean and wrote again. "Are all parties truly consenting?" His gaze moved to Eleanor, who was watching this exchange with obvious surprise. In all the years they had both lived in the shadow of Timber Creek, they had never directly communicated. Now, with the weight of her future hanging in the balance, they were connecting across the divide of their shared silence. "Mr. Blackwood," Mackenzie's voice took on an edge of warning, "your reputation for peculiarities is well known in these parts, but I would caution you against interfering in legitimate business matters." James ignored him, walking deliberately to Eleanor's side. He held up his slate with a question meant only for her. "What do you want?" Her hands moved in signs he couldn't understand, but her eyes told him everything. The fear, the desperation, and beneath it all, a fierce determination not to be reduced to a transaction. Thomas looked up from the papers, confusion and hope warring in his expression. "Mr. Blackwood, while I appreciate your concern, this is a family matter," James wrote quickly. "A community matter. Exploitation harms all of US." Mackenzie's patience was clearly wearing thin. "This is becoming tedious. Mr. Reed, either you're prepared to conclude our transaction, or you're not. My offer expires at noon today." The pressure tactic was transparent, designed to force a decision before alternatives could be considered. James had seen the same strategy used by predators in the wilderness: isolate the target, cut off escape routes, apply pressure until resistance collapsed. Eleanor touched James's arm, drawing his attention. Her fingers traced letters in the frost that had formed on his sleeve. HELP. In that moment, James made a decision that would change everything, not just for the Reed family, but for his own understanding of what connection truly meant. He stepped forward, slate in hand, and wrote a message that would alter the course of all their lives. "I will pay Thomas Reed's debt in full, cash, no conditions." The words hung in the winter air like smoke from a gunshot, unexpected and charged with possibility. James Blackwood felt every eye turn toward him. Thomas's desperate hope, Eleanor's stunned surprise, Mackenzie's sharp suspicion, and the gathering crowd of townspeople who had begun to sense that something significant was unfolding outside the trading post. "Mr. Blackwood," Mackenzie's voice carried a dangerous edge, "surely you're not thinking of interfering in a private business transaction between willing parties." James erased his slate and wrote with deliberate care, offering an alternative: "My money, their choice." His intervention had fundamentally altered the dynamics of the confrontation. By offering to pay the debt without conditions, he had created an option that exposed Mackenzie's proposal for what it truly was: not a business arrangement, but exploitation of desperation. Mackenzie's confident demeanor had begun to crack. "This is highly irregular. Mr. Reed has already indicated his willingness to accept my offer." James wrote again, "Let him choose freely, without coercion." Thomas stepped closer, still clutching the marriage contract that had felt like his daughter's death warrant moments before. "Mr. Blackwood, why would you do this? You hardly know us." James considered the question carefully before writing his response. because some things should not be for sale. The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any elaborate justification. Eleanor's hands moved rapidly in signs that James couldn't understand, but he could read the emotion in her eyes: gratitude, hope, and something more complex that he couldn't quite identify. Thomas translated haltingly. "My daughter asks why a man who values solitude would involve himself in our troubles." James wrote, "Silence and isolation are not the same. I chose one, not both." Eleanor's expression softened in recognition of a truth she understood better than anyone else present. They might both live in worlds of silence, but while hers had been imposed by illness, his was a deliberate choice, a barrier he had constructed to protect himself from a world that had shown him too much horror. McKenzie was not prepared to surrender his advantage so easily. "Mr. Blackwood, while your intervention is touching, I have to wonder if you fully understand the financial implications. Mr. Reed's debt is substantial." James reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked heavily with the sound of gold coins. Years of trapping in the high country, trading furs at fair prices in larger settlements rather than at McKenzie's exploitative rates, had given him more wealth than most people suspected. He had lived simply not out of necessity but by choice, finding peace in the absence of the complications that money often brought. "I understand completely," he wrote. "Name the exact amount." Thomas swallowed hard. $912, with interest. Without hesitation, James began counting gold eagles onto the trading post counter. Each coin, worth $10, made a solid sound as it joined the growing pile. The crowd that had gathered watched in stunned silence as the fortune accumulated, a physical representation of freedom being purchased back from the brink of exploitation. McKenzie's expression darkened as he watched his carefully constructed scheme collapse. "This is most irregular," he repeated, though his tone had lost its earlier confidence. Mr. Reed had already verbally committed to our arrangement. James wrote, "No contract is signed. No verbal agreement is binding when made under duress." The legal principle, quoted with surprising precision, suggested a level of education that few would have associated with the silent trapper. McKenzie clearly recognized that he was facing not just interference, but informed opposition to his tactics. When the last coin was placed, 91 gold eagles and 2 silver dollars, James wrote a final message: "Debt paid in full, witnessed by the community. All obligations cleared." Thomas stared at the pile of gold, his hands trembling. "Mr. Blackwood, this is... I don't know how we can ever repay such generosity." James shook his head and wrote, "Not a loan, a statement. Some things cannot be bought, or sold." Eleanor moved to stand beside James, her presence a silent affirmation of connection that transcended words. Her hands formed signs that James couldn't understand, but her eyes conveyed a gratitude that needed no translation. Thomas translated, his voice thick with emotion. "My daughter says that debts of the heart can never be measured in gold, but they are the only debts worth carrying." The wisdom in the statement surprised James, revealing depths to Eleanor that he had glimpsed but never fully appreciated during their brief encounters in town. She was not merely a young woman trapped in silence, but a soul who had found meaning and clarity through her isolation, just as he had found a certain peace in his. McKenzie, recognizing defeat, gathered the gold with barely concealed fury. "The bank will be notified that Mr. Reed's debt has been settled in full," he said stiffly. "I trust that concludes our business." "Not quite," Thomas said, finding strength in the unexpected turn of events. "I believe you still have my property deed." The deed was returned with obvious reluctance. As McKenzie retreated into his trading post, the community that had gathered began to disperse, carrying with them a story that would be told and retold throughout the territory. How a man who had chosen silence had spoken more clearly through actions than most men could, through a lifetime of words. As Thomas and Eleanor prepared to return home with their burden lifted, James found himself facing an unexpected question. Eleanor approached him directly, her hands forming simple gestures that even he could understand. An invitation to join them, to share a meal in gratitude, to cross the threshold of isolation he had maintained for so long. For a moment, the invitation triggered the familiar urge to retreat, to return to the safety of his solitary existence, where the complications of human connection couldn't reach him. But as he looked into Eleanor's eyes, he saw something that resonated with his own experience. The understanding that silence could be both prison and sanctuary, depending on who shared it with you. He nodded once, a simple acceptance that somehow felt more significant than any of the gold coins he had spent. As he helped Thomas and Eleanor prepare their sled for the journey home, the first tentative threads of connection began to form between two souls who had each found their own way to navigate a world that had no place for their silence. The journey back to the Reed homestead passed in a silence different from the one that had accompanied their departure, a silence of relief rather than resignation, of possibilities rather than endings. The winter afternoon had begun its early descent into twilight, turning the snow-covered landscape into a canvas of blue shadows and golden light that seemed to mirror the shifting fortunes of the day. James Blackwood sat beside Thomas on the sled bench, his presence solid and reassuring in a way that required no words. Eleanor rode behind them, her eyes taking in the familiar terrain with renewed appreciation. What had seemed like a prison of ice and hardship that morning now appeared as a sanctuary preserved against impossible odds. "Mr. Blackwood." Thomas spoke finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "I still don't understand why you did what you did back there. That was a fortune you parted with." James withdrew his slate, wiping away frost before writing, "Money has no purpose if not used when needed most." The simplicity of the statement carried profound wisdom. Eleanor leaned forward to read the slate, her mittened hand resting briefly on James's shoulder in a gesture of understanding that transcended their separate silences. "Still," Thomas persisted, "most men would have looked the other way. It wasn't your burden to carry." James considered this before writing again. "Ignoring injustice makes us complicit in it." Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing the truth in those chalk-written words. "You're a surprising man, Mr. Blackwood. The stories people tell about you in town, they don't capture who you really are at all." A hint of a smile touched James's lips, the first such expression either of the Reeds had seen on his face. He wiped his slate clean, but didn't immediately write anything new, as though acknowledging that sometimes the spaces between words held as much meaning as the words themselves. As they approached the Reed homestead, Eleanor tapped her father's shoulder and signed rapidly. "My daughter wonders if you would join us for supper," Thomas translated. "It's not much, just rabbit stew and the last of our cornbread, but it would mean a great deal to us." James hesitated, the invitation representing a crossing of boundaries he had maintained for years. It was one thing to intervene in a public injustice, quite another to enter the intimate space of a family home, to engage in the small rituals of connection that he had deliberately abandoned. Eleanor seemed to sense his hesitation. She moved her hands in a sequence of gestures meant for her father. "Eleanor says," Thomas translated with a slight smile, "that silence is always more bearable when shared with someone who understands its language." The insight struck James with unexpected force. He had thought of his silence as armor, as separation, as protection against a world too chaotic and cruel to navigate. He had never considered that silence itself might be a language that could connect rather than divide, that could be understood rather than merely endured. He nodded his acceptance, and Eleanor's smile illuminated her face with a warmth that seemed to push back against the gathering winter darkness. The Reed cabin was modest but meticulously maintained, despite the hardships its owners had faced. A small fire burned in the hearth, carefully banked to conserve precious firewood. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with handcrafted furniture that spoke to Thomas's skill as a carpenter. Eleanor moved with practiced efficiency, adding wood to the fire, stirring the pot of stew that had been simmering all day, and setting their small table with the careful grace of someone who found dignity in simplicity. James watched her movements, struck by the eloquence of her gestures, how her hands seemed to speak not just in formal signs but in the poetry of everyday actions. "Please make yourself comfortable," Thomas invited, gesturing to a chair near the fire. "It'll take a few minutes to get everything ready." James sat, feeling strangely out of place yet welcomed. His eyes wandered to the cabin walls, where carefully preserved drawings hung in simple frames, charcoal sketches of animals, landscapes, and occasionally people from town, all rendered with surprising skill and sensitivity. Noticing his interest, Thomas commented, "Eleanor's work. She's always had a gift for seeing what others miss." After she lost her voice, the drawings became another way for her to speak. James moved closer to examine the artwork. Each piece captured not just the physical appearance of its subject, but something essential about its nature. The watchful wariness of a fox, the patient strength of a draft horse, the weathered dignity of an old trapper he recognized from town. Her vision was both honest and compassionate, seeing clearly without judgment. One drawing in particular caught his attention, a self-portrait Eleanor had created, showing herself with birds perched on her shoulders and hands, as though they were drawn to her silence rather than deterred by it. In the image, she wasn't diminished by her inability to speak but somehow enhanced, connected to the natural world in ways those with voices might never understand. Eleanor approached, carrying a steaming bowl of stew. She followed his gaze to the self-portrait and signed something to her father. She says that was from the summer after her fever, when she was still learning to live in silence, Thomas explained. The birds would come to her when she sat perfectly still in the meadow. She began to think that perhaps her silence wasn't a loss, but a different kind of gift. James reached for his slate. It gave you different eyes. Eleanor nodded, her expression brightening at being so perfectly understood. She set the stew before him and signed directly to him. Slow, deliberate gestures that he might grasp even without translation. She pointed to him, then to her eyes, then to her heart, then back to him. She says you see with different eyes, too, Thomas translated, though the meaning had already reached James directly. The meal was simple but nourishing, made special not by its contents, but by the shared moment it represented. James found himself in the unfamiliar position of being part of a family circle, included in the small rituals and silent communications that passed between father and daughter. Though he contributed no words to the conversation, his presence was neither awkward nor overlooked. After they had eaten, Thomas excused himself to check on their livestock, leaving Eleanor and James alone by the fire. A moment that might have been uncomfortable instead settled into a peaceful quiet, a shared understanding that silence needn't be filled with words to have meaning. Eleanor reached for a sketchbook and charcoal that lay on a small table beside her chair. With swift, sure strokes, she began to draw, occasionally glancing up at James as her hands moved across the paper. He sat still, allowing himself to be seen in a way he had avoided for years, feeling strangely unburdened by her careful attention. When she turned the sketchbook toward him, James found himself looking at an image of striking clarity, his own face rendered not as the inscrutable mask he presented to the world, but as a landscape of hard-won wisdom and carefully guarded compassion. She had drawn him as he might have been before the war, before the horrors that had stolen his voice, yet also as he truly was now, a man who had found his own path back to humanity through silence rather than despite it. James reached for his slate, then hesitated, setting it aside. Instead, he extended his hand, palm up, a gesture of openness that required no chalk-written explanation. Eleanor placed her hand in his, a bridge forming between two islands of silence. In that moment of connection, something shifted in James's understanding of his own isolation. He had believed himself set apart, broken in ways that couldn't be mended, until he encountered someone who lived in silence not as a prison, but as a different way of experiencing the world. Eleanor's silence hadn't diminished her. It had transformed her, giving her insights and perceptions that others, too busy with their own voices, might never achieve. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Outside, the winter wind whispered through pine branches, a sound so familiar to James from his solitary travels that it felt like a voice from home. But for the first time in years, he didn't yearn for the isolation of his cabin or the wordless company of the wilderness. He had found a different kind of peace in this unexpected connection, a recognition that perhaps healing wasn't about recovering what was lost, but discovering new ways to be whole. Thomas returned, stamping snow from his boots at the threshold. He paused, taking in the tableau before him, his daughter and the silent trapper, hands clasped in a moment of perfect understanding. His expression softened with something between surprise and recognition, as though witnessing the first green shoot emerging from winter-hardened ground. "It's getting late," he observed gently. "The snow's picking up. Mr. Blackwood, you're welcome to our spare room for the night." It wouldn't be wise to travel back to town in the dark. James withdrew his hand from Eleanor's and reached for his slate. Thank you. I accept. The spare room was small but comfortable, furnished with a narrow bed, a chest for storage, and a small table bearing a lantern. The window looked out onto the snow-covered forest, moonlight filtering through clouds to cast blue shadows across pristine white. It was a view James knew well from countless nights spent in the wilderness, yet somehow different when seen through the frame of a home, with the knowledge of other souls nearby. He sat on the edge of the bed, his customary solitude now feeling strangely hollow after the warmth of shared company. His fingers traced the edge of his slate, thinking of all the words trapped inside him, the stories he couldn't tell, the experiences locked away behind the wall of silence he had built to contain memories too painful to voice. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Eleanor entered carrying extra blankets, her expression questioning whether her intrusion was welcome. James nodded, making room for her to set down her burden. Instead of leaving immediately, she seated herself beside him, her hands moving in careful gestures. Without Thomas to translate, she kept her signs simple, or supplemented them with sketches in a small notebook she carried. Slowly, through this improvised communication, they began to share fragments of their separate journeys into silence. James learned that Eleanor had been 16 when the fever took her voice, already a young woman with dreams and plans, suddenly thrust into a world that had little patience for those who couldn't speak for themselves. She drew the faces of those who had turned away from her afterward, those who had treated her as less than whole, those who had stopped seeing her as a person with thoughts and feelings, and begun seeing only her limitation. In turn, he wrote brief notes about the war, not the horrors that had sealed his lips, but the moments of humanity he had witnessed even amid destruction. Soldiers from opposite sides sharing tobacco during an unofficial truce, a field surgeon working tirelessly to save both friend and foe, the strange beauty of dawn breaking over a battlefield, temporarily stilled. Their exchange was neither full confession nor casual conversation, but something in between, an offering of trust, a recognition of kinship, the beginning of a bridge between separate islands. Eleanor drew a picture of two birds perched on a branch, heads tilted toward each other in silent communion. Beneath it she wrote in careful letters, "Some songs don't need to be heard to be understood." James studied the image, feeling something long frozen within him begin to thaw. He had thought his silence a punishment, a reaction to a world too brutal to engage with directly. She had transformed her silence into a different kind of language, a perspective that allowed her to see and express truth in ways that went beyond words. He wrote, "I chose silence. You had it forced upon you. Yet you've made it something beautiful." Eleanor shook her head, then wrote beneath his words, "We both lost one way of speaking. We both found others." The insight struck him with the force of revelation. His retreat into silence had never truly been complete. He had continued to communicate through actions, through the care he took in his work, through moments of integrity witnessed by the community, even as they maintained their distance. He had not lost his voice so much as transformed it, just as Eleanor had found expression through her art and her graceful hands. Before she left him to his rest, Eleanor placed her sketchbook on his lap, open to a fresh page. She pressed a piece of charcoal into his palm, then pointed to his chest and to the paper, her meaning clear. Some stories can only be told when we find new ways to speak them. Alone again, James stared at the blank page for long minutes before tentatively beginning to draw. His strokes were uncertain at first, lacking Eleanor's practiced skill, but gradually gaining confidence as images emerged from his memories. Not the horrors of war that had sealed his lips, but the landscapes that had healed him afterward, the mountains and forests that had offered sanctuary when human company became unbearable. By lantern light, he filled page after page, each image a piece of the story he couldn't tell with words. Each stroke of charcoal, a small act of liberation from the prison of unspoken experience. When exhaustion finally claimed him, James slept more deeply than he had in years, his dreams unthreatened by the usual specters of the past. In their place were images of snow-covered meadows, silent forests, and a young woman whose hands spoke with the grace of birds in flight. Morning arrived with the soft blue light of winter dawn, filtering through frost-covered windows. James woke to the sounds of quiet movement in the main room, the crackle of a freshly built fire, the gentle clatter of cooking utensils, the domestic rhythm of a household beginning its day. For a moment, disorientation swept over him. 7 years of waking to absolute solitude had conditioned him to expect emptiness, silence, self-reliance. The awareness of others nearby, their presence, their movements, their unspoken expectations, triggered an instinctive urge to retreat, to return to the known territory of isolation. He sat up, reaching for his boots with the intention of making a quiet departure before the complications of human connection could entangle him further. But as he moved, his eyes fell on the sketchbook beside his bed, pages filled with the images he had drawn in the night, his first attempt in years to communicate something of his inner landscape to another soul. The sight gave him pause. There was vulnerability in those drawings, a willingness to be seen that he had denied himself for so long. To leave now, without acknowledgement, would be to retreat not just from this household, but from the possibility of genuine connection that had opened before him. James completed dressing, then gathered the sketchbook and his slate before stepping into the main room. Thomas was nowhere to be seen, likely attending to morning chores, but Eleanor stood by the stove, her back to him as she prepared breakfast. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, her face lighting with a smile that struck him with unexpected force. There was no guardedness in her expression, no careful assessment or polite distance, just genuine pleasure at his presence, as though his company were a gift rather than an obligation. James held out the sketchbook, offering it with a slight bow of his head. Eleanor accepted it, curiosity in her eyes as she opened to the first page. Her expression changed as she took in his drawings, surprise giving way to deep attention, followed by a recognition that needed no words to convey. She looked up at him, her gaze holding his with an intensity that communicated more clearly than any signed phrase could have done. In that moment of connection, James understood that she was seeing not just the images he had created, but the man behind them, the experiences that had shaped him, the journey that had led him to silence, and the possibility that his isolation might not be as permanent or necessary as he had believed. Eleanor set the sketchbook aside and moved her hands in a sequence of signs. Without Thomas to translate, James couldn't grasp their specific meaning, but her expression and the deliberate care of her movements conveyed a depth of understanding that transcended literal comprehension. He wrote on his slate, "Thank you for seeing." She nodded, then gestured toward the table where breakfast waited. A simple offering of food, company, and the possibility of beginning a day not in solitude but in shared silence. As they ate, James felt the familiar weight of his isolation lifting further, replaced by something he had almost forgotten. The quiet comfort of human presence without demand or expectation, the simple pleasure of existence acknowledged by another soul. Thomas joined them, bringing with him the crisp scent of winter air and news from their small barn. "The chickens have finally started laying again," he announced, his tone suggesting this small victory held special significance. "First eggs in nearly a month. Perhaps our fortunes truly are turning." Eleanor's hands moved in quick signs that made her father laugh. "She says the chickens must have heard about our debt being paid and decided it was safe to contribute again." Thomas translated, his expression lighter than James had ever seen it. The domesticity of the moment, this small family celebration of modest abundance, the gentle humor shared between father and daughter, struck James with unexpected poignancy. How long had it been since he had participated in such ordinary joy? How completely had he convinced himself that such moments were no longer meant for him? After breakfast, as Thomas prepared to check their trap lines, James reached for his slate to write his farewell. He had already imposed on their hospitality longer than propriety dictated, and the pull of familiar solitude tugged at him with the force of long habit. Before he could write, Eleanor touched his arm lightly, drawing his attention. She signed something to her father, her expression holding a question. "Eleanor wonders if you might stay another day," Thomas translated, looking somewhat surprised himself. "She says there's something she'd like to show you in the forest, weather permitting." James hesitated, caught between the safety of retreat and the unfamiliar territory of continued connection. The invitation represented more than a simple excursion. It was an offer to enter Eleanor's world more fully, to see through her eyes, to extend this unexpected bridge between their separate silences. He glanced out the window at the bright winter day, the storm of the previous night having given way to clear skies and brilliant sunshine that transformed the snow-covered landscape into a sea of diamonds. It was a perfect day for traveling, for returning to his cabin, and the routines that had structured his existence for so long. It was also, he realized, a perfect day for discovering something new, for allowing possibility, rather than habit, to guide his choices. James turned back to Eleanor and nodded his acceptance, watching as her face brightened with a smile that seemed to hold the same radiance as the winter sunlight outside, a brightness that promised warmth even in the heart of the coldest season. The forest in winter possessed a hushed grandeur that James had always appreciated during his solitary travels. Towering pines laden with snow, frozen streams transformed into ribbons of silver glass, animal tracks telling stories of life persisting despite the season's challenges. Today, however, he experienced these familiar wonders through new eyes, following Eleanor along paths he might never have discovered alone. She moved through the snow with practiced ease, pausing occasionally to point out details he might have missed. The way sunlight fractured through ice crystals hanging from branches, creating miniature rainbows on the snow beneath. The precise pattern of woodpecker holes spiraling up a dead pine. The almost invisible entrance to a fox den tucked beneath twisted roots. Though they exchanged no words, their communication flowed with surprising ease. Eleanor would gesture towards something that caught her attention, and James would nod his understanding or indicate his own discoveries with a touch on her shoulder. When explanation was needed, she would sketch quick images in her notebook, or write brief words in the snow with a stick. After an hour of walking, the trees began to thin, and James realized they were approaching a clearing he had never encountered in his own explorations. Eleanor turned to him, her expression a mixture of excitement and something like nervousness, as though she were about to share a precious secret. The clearing, when they reached it, took James's breath away. It was perfectly circular, ringed by ancient pines whose branches created a natural cathedral overhead. At its center stood the petrified remains of what must have been an enormous tree, its stone branches reaching skyward like frozen lightning. Eleanor led him forward, her steps slowing as they approached the stone tree. She gestured for him to wait, then circled the petrified trunk, disappearing briefly from view. A moment later, a sound broke the winter silence, a pure, clear note that seemed to hover in the frigid air. James stepped around the trunk to find Eleanor standing before a remarkable structure, what appeared to be a natural wind harp, created from the hollowed section of the petrified tree. Thin branches had been carefully positioned to catch the breeze flowing through the clearing, creating strings that vibrated with ethereal music when the wind passed through them. Eleanor's hands moved in a flowing gesture that needed no translation. Listen. As if in response to her invitation, the wind strengthened, drawing a cascade of notes from the stone harp, some high and delicate as birdsong, others deep and resonant as distant thunder. The music had no recognizable melody, following instead the unpredictable patterns of the winter breeze, yet it possessed a wild harmony that seemed to speak directly to something long dormant in James's soul. Eleanor watched his face, gauging his reaction with careful attention. When she saw the wonder in his eyes, she smiled and touched her throat, then her ears, then gestured to the stone harp, a sequence James understood immediately. For someone who could not speak, who lived in perpetual silence, this place was voice and song, a way to experience music without words. She reached into her pack and withdrew a small journal bound in worn leather. Opening it, she showed James pages filled with careful notations. Not traditional musical notation, but a system of her own invention, marks and symbols that recorded the patterns of wind and sound in this secret cathedral. James realized he was being shown something precious beyond measure, not just a hidden place of beauty, but the private language Eleanor had developed to communicate with a world that many believed had fallen silent for her. In sharing this sanctuary, she was offering him far more than a pleasant excursion. She was inviting him into her most intimate experience of finding voice in silence. He removed his glove and placed his hand against the stone harp, feeling the subtle vibrations of music traveling through ancient wood turned to stone. The sensation was unlike anything he had experienced. Sound made tangible, music transformed into touch, as though the boundary between senses had somehow dissolved in this sacred space. Eleanor stepped beside him, placing her hand next to his on the petrified surface. Together they stood, connected to the music and to each other through this bridge of vibration and stone. In that moment of shared perception, James felt the walls he had built around his silence begin to crumble, not exposing him to the chaos and pain he had sought to contain, but opening him to possibilities he had forgotten existed. After the music had worked its spell, they settled on a fallen log near the stone harp, sharing the provisions Eleanor had packed: bread, cheese, and dried apples. Simple fare, made extraordinary by the setting and the company. The winter sun had reached its zenith, casting the clearing in brilliant light that seemed to illuminate not just the physical space but something deeper, more essential. James reached for his slate, compelled to express something of what he was experiencing. He wrote, "How did you find this place?" Eleanor took the slate and wrote, beneath his question, "I was lost after my illness, wandering. The wind led me here." She handed the slate back, then added more. "This place taught me that silence has its own music, that even without a voice, I could still hear and be heard." The wisdom in her words struck James with particular force. He had viewed his own silence as an ending, a severance from the world of human connection. Eleanor had transformed her silence into a beginning, a different way of experiencing and communicating that opened doors he had never imagined existed. He wrote, "I've been hiding in my silence. You've been exploring yours." Eleanor studied his words, then nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. She reached for the slate again. Silence can be a prison or a pathway. The difference is in how we walk with it. As they sat together in that winter cathedral, the stone harp playing its windsong beside them, James felt something shift within him. Not a dramatic revelation, but a quiet realignment, like ice beginning to thaw after a long freeze. His silence had been a fortress, built to contain memories too painful to voice, experiences too horrific to share. But fortresses, while they might offer protection, also imprisoned those within their walls. Eleanor had found a different way. Her silence, imposed rather than chosen, had become not a place of confinement, but a territory for exploration, a unique perspective that allowed her to perceive what others, too busy with their own voices, might never notice. The music of wind through stone, the language of gesture and expression, the eloquence of carefully observed details. They spent the afternoon in the clearing, sometimes communicating through the slate, sometimes simply existing together in the peaceful quiet, listening to the stone harp's unpredictable symphony. As the winter sun began its early descent, casting long blue shadows across the snow, Eleanor stood and gestured toward the path that would lead them back to the cabin. The return journey passed in comfortable silence, both of them wrapped in their own thoughts, yet somehow more connected than before. James found himself noticing details with new appreciation. Not just the wilderness he had always valued, but the subtle signs of Eleanor's presence beside him. The rhythm of her breathing, the precise movements of her hands as she brushed snow from branches that might have struck him, the careful attention she paid to his comfort despite her own familiarity with the cold. They emerged from the forest as twilight began to settle over the landscape, the Reed cabin glowing with welcoming lamplight in the gathering darkness. Thomas stood on the porch, his expression shifting from concern to relief as he spotted them approaching through the deepening shadows. "I was beginning to worry," he called, coming to meet them. "The temperature's dropping fast." Eleanor signed rapidly, her gestures animated with enthusiasm. "She took you to the stone harp?" Thomas translated, looking at James with surprise. "She's never shown anyone else that place. Not even me." The significance of this revelation wasn't lost on James. He glanced at Eleanor, who met his gaze with quiet intensity, neither embarrassed by her father's disclosure, nor apologetic for her private sanctuary. Inside the cabin, warmed by the fire and the simple pleasure of hot food after hours in the cold, the three of them settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Thomas working on a carving project while sharing stories of Eleanor's childhood, Eleanor sketching impressions from their day in the forest, James listening and occasionally contributing through his slate. As the evening deepened into night, Thomas excused himself, citing an early morning of chores ahead. Before retiring, he paused beside James's chair, his hand resting briefly on the silent man's shoulder. "You're welcome here, Mr. Blackwood, for as long as you'd care to stay." The invitation, offered with simple sincerity, carried more significance than its straightforward words might suggest. In the close-knit society of frontier settlements, where resources were precious and each person's contribution carefully weighed, such openness to a man known primarily for his isolation represented a rare form of acceptance. After Thomas had gone, Eleanor and James remained by the fire, the comfortable silence between them now layered with new understanding. She worked on a sketch, her charcoal moving across the paper with sure strokes, while he watched the flames dance in patterns as unpredictable and mesmerizing as the music of the stone harp. When she turned the sketchbook toward him, James found himself looking at an image of striking perception. Himself standing beside the petrified tree, one hand touching the stone, his expression capturing a moment of awakening that he hadn't realized was visible to anyone else. She had drawn him not as he appeared to the world, but as he had felt in that sacred moment of connection, a man discovering that what he had thought was an ending might actually be a beginning. Beneath the drawing, Eleanor had written, "Some journeys have no words, only the next step taken in faith." James studied the image and the words, feeling their truth resonate in places long closed within him. He had believed his path set, a solitary existence defined by the boundaries of his silence, a life carefully constructed to contain pain rather than risk connection. Now he found himself contemplating possibilities he had thought forever beyond his reach. He wrote on his slate, "I don't know how to walk any path but alone." Eleanor considered his words, then wrote beneath them, "Neither did I, until someone walked beside me without trying to change my direction." The insight struck James with particular force. During their day in the forest, Eleanor hadn't attempted to draw him out of his silence or impose her understanding on his experience. She had simply invited him to share her perspective, to see through her eyes while remaining true to his own vision. In doing so, she had offered the rarest gift: acceptance without condition, companionship without demand. As the fire burned low, casting the room in a warm amber glow, James found himself at a crossroads he hadn't anticipated when he first intervened in McKenzie's transaction. He had acted out of a fundamental belief in justice, without expectation of personal consequence. Now he faced the possibility that his impulsive act of integrity might lead to something he had considered permanently beyond his reach: a life not defined by isolation, a silence shared rather than enforced, a path walked in company rather than solitude. The prospect was both exhilarating and terrifying. To open himself to connection was to risk pain, to make himself vulnerable in ways he had carefully avoided for years. Yet to retreat now, to return to the safety of his solitary existence, would be to reject a chance at wholeness he might never find again. Eleanor seemed to sense his internal struggle. She reached across the space between them and took his hand in hers, her touch communicating more clearly than words could have done. Reassurance, patience, understanding that such transformations couldn't be rushed or forced, only nurtured with gentleness and time. When morning came, James woke to the sound of activity in the cabin, Thomas preparing for his day, Eleanor moving about the kitchen with quiet efficiency. For a moment he lay still, listening to these domestic rhythms with a strange mixture of comfort and apprehension. 3 days ago he had been completely alone, his life structured entirely around solitude and self-reliance. Now he found himself enmeshed in the patterns of a family, experiencing connections he had believed forever severed by the trauma that had sealed his lips. He rose, dressed, and joined the Reeds in the main room, his slate already prepared with the message he had decided upon during the night. "I must return to my cabin today. There are matters requiring attention." Thomas nodded, accepting this announcement without question. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. We're grateful for all you've done, and for your company these past days." Eleanor's reaction was less easily read, a flicker of something crossing her expressive face before she composed her features into a smile of understanding. She signed to her father, who translated, "Eleanor asks if you would allow us to accompany you part of the way. She has some herbs to gather near the North Ridge, and it would be on your route." James hesitated, then nodded his agreement. The prospect of a gradual separation seemed easier than an abrupt departure, a transition rather than an ending. After breakfast, they set out across the snow-covered landscape, Thomas leading with his rifle at the ready in case they encountered game, Eleanor and James following side by side. The morning was brilliantly clear, the world transformed into crystal and silver, under a sky so deeply blue it seemed almost unreal. They traveled in companionable silence for nearly an hour before reaching a fork in the trail where their paths would diverge. Thomas and Eleanor continuing toward the ridge where medicinal plants could be found even in winter. James proceeding alone to his cabin deeper in the wilderness. At this juncture, Thomas stepped aside, ostensibly to examine animal tracks in the snow, granting Eleanor and James a moment of privacy for their farewell. She turned to face him, her expression serious as her hands moved in a sequence of signs he had come to recognize over their days together. Gratitude, friendship, hope. Then she reached into her pack and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft buckskin, offering it with a slight bow that conveyed its significance. James accepted the package, carefully unwrapping it to reveal a carving of remarkable craftsmanship, a miniature replica of the stone harp, each detail rendered with loving precision in pale birchwood. When he turned it over, he discovered tiny holes drilled through the base, positioned so that when held to the wind, it would produce its own subtle music. The gift moved him beyond his capacity to express through written words. It represented not just their shared experience in the forest sanctuary, but a profound understanding of his journey, offering him a way to carry that moment of connection with him, a tangible reminder that silence could contain music if one knew how to listen. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew his own offering, a small piece of stone he had collected from beside the petrified tree, into which he had carefully carved a simple spiral, the ancient symbol of journey and return. It was a modest token compared to her exquisite handiwork, but he hoped it would convey what he couldn't say directly, that though he was returning to his solitude, something fundamental had changed, that his path might now be a spiral rather than an endless straight line into isolation. Eleanor accepted the carved stone, closing her fingers around it as though receiving something precious beyond measure. Her eyes, meeting his, communicated understanding that transcended their mutual silence, recognition that this parting wasn't an ending but a pause, a necessary step in a journey neither of them could fully envision, but both now acknowledged had begun. Thomas rejoined them, tactfully ignoring the evidence of exchanged gifts. "Well, Mr. Blackwood, I suppose this is where we part ways for now. You should know that our door remains open to you, whenever you might choose to pass through it." James nodded, his customary reserve softened by genuine gratitude. He wrote on his slate, "Thank you for sharing your hearth and your hearts." With a final glance at Eleanor, whose smile contained both sadness and something that might have been hope, James turned toward the path that would lead him home. Each step carrying him back toward familiar solitude felt different now, not a retreat into safety, but a necessary return to gather himself before the next phase of an unexpected journey. The days that followed passed in a strange mixture of familiar routine and profound reconsideration. James attended to his traps, prepared pelts for trading, maintained his cabin with the same meticulous care as always. Yet something had shifted in his experience of these solitary tasks. They no longer felt like ends in themselves, the entirety of his existence, but rather as parts of a life that might contain more than he had allowed himself to imagine. Each evening, he found himself taking out Eleanor's carved harp, holding it to catch the draft from his cabin's small window, listening to its whispered music with growing appreciation for what it represented. The possibility that silence could be not an absence but a presence, not a wall but a doorway. On the 7th day after his return, as winter sunshine streamed through frost-covered glass, James made a decision. He packed a small bundle of supplies, carefully wrapped Eleanor's carving in soft fur, and secured his cabin for a journey of uncertain duration.